can go ahead and get us started and welcome some folks here. So hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Leveling Up Your State Public Affairs Program with Benchmarking and Strategies. We'll give folks a few more minutes to get logged in, and in the meantime, we'd love to see folks drop in the chat where you're tuning in from, whether it's still super hot or you're enjoying some cooler weather. Looking forward to hearing from folks. Henry, you're coming from where, California?
I'm in San Francisco. Yeah. So my weather beats anyone else's. I didn't want to lead with I'm in San Francisco and it's 68 degrees. So morning, everyone.
I'm sure you have us all beat.
I usually take a back seat during kind of the summer weather kickoff questions.
Well, I haven't been outside yet today in New York, so I'm just kind of letting myself believe that it's also a balmy 68 outside, but we'll find out a little bit later.
There you go.
There you go. Got some folks coming in from DC, it's cooler than normal. And other East Coast folks, Philadelphia, good stuff. Wow, we've got people from all over, Washington, Florida. Both Washingtons. All right, cool. I think we've given folks a couple minutes to hop in, so we'll go ahead and get started, but we'll love to keep kind of seeing in the chat where folks are coming in from if you haven't shared. But I'll go ahead and get us started. So again, if folks weren't here the first time, welcome to today's webinar, Leveling Up Your State Public Affairs Program, Benchmarking and Strategies. And before we dive in, I'll just share a couple of quick housekeeping notes, and then I'll hand the floor over to Henry. So please just first note that today, that the session is being recorded, and so we'll distribute the recording after the event. And if you have any questions, you can submit them in the Q&A tab near the chat buttons. So now we'll get started with some intros. First, I'll introduce myself. I'm Dana Myers. I'm on the product marketing team here at Quorum. I also want to acknowledge Molly, who is supporting us on the back end of our webinar. And so you'll see her name occasionally in the chat. I might ask her to highlight a couple of your questions. So I want to thank Molly for her help today. And while Molly is on most of our webinars, so Molly, rockstar. And then we'll introduce Henry Bowditch, who is leading today's webinar. So Henry's been part of the Quorum team since 2019 and is currently an enterprise sales executive. So I want to thank you, Henry, for sharing your expertise with us today, and I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Dana. I actually created a little slide for myself. So as Dana mentioned, I've been with Quorum since 2019, and prior to Quorum, I was a lobbyist before the Colorado General Assembly. So my background's in state government affairs. If anyone has Colorado in their portfolio, hopefully they're one of your more well-behaved states. And if not, I guess invest in Quorum and we'll put them back in your predictable column. End of sales pitch. So today we're going to talk a little bit about state and local benchmarking and what a really effective state and local government affairs team looks like. And I want to start, we have people coming to this webinar from various places of familiarity with our company. Some are clients, some are not clients who know us, some are not people who have seen been on a Quorum webinar before. So I want us to take a couple minutes at the top to describe why we built Quorum and why we're really excited about our solutions in the state and local space. So the why Quorum, why we built Quorum, the macro trend that our company is betting on is that policy making and the policy influencing processes are getting more complex. 10 years ago, when the company was founded, we were tracking federal legislation, federal regulations, state legislation, state regulations. And now there are so many different ways that public officials influence the policymaking process. We're now capturing 10,000 new documents every day from Capitol Hill and many thousands more from state legislatures, just because as there are kind of fewer bills and regulations that move through the process, there are significantly more dialogue on social media channels and in press releases and in committee hearings that people care a lot about. So the kind of trend that the company is betting on is that things are getting more complicated, and the ways in which organizations try to interact with officials or get in front of policymakers needs to become more innovative as well. And let me, I can't use my keypads. There we go. And so we have surveyed a number of our clients over the past year to understand like what challenges typically impact these teams. The number one, obviously, is if you increase the complexity of the policy-making process, but you don't increase the resources for teams who are responsible for influencing policymakers, then that leads to a staffing issue. And we hear from lots and lots of folks that we're not appropriately resourced. Our organization doesn't appropriately resource us, even though they understand how important the policymaking process is. And then the kind of second one here, chiefly, there's just too much information to track out there. We've gone from like a narrow set of lawmakers introducing kind of pretty important legislation to lots and lots of lawmakers introducing stuff and lots of, ways they're talking about policymaking in adjacent mediums like social media, press releases, those that I mentioned earlier. Some that relate more to the advocacy side are like it's really difficult to move people into action. People are kind of dejected by the political landscape, and so it's hard to get them to engage. And then it's really hard to get the attention of lawmakers and other decision makers. And so probably the most important thing that we do for our customers is to think really creatively about how we build new features or products that help our clients connect with the people that they need to connect to. And our kind of unique take on this, this kind of problem is that siloed activity compounds the problem. Some organizations have a federal team, a state team, a grassroots team, a PAC, a local team. So they've got multiple different people at their organization reaching out to a similar audience of elected officials, but may not be communicating really effectively. And at the state and local level, this looks like, state lawmakers who become county commissioners or vice versa. And someone else at the organization has a really strong relationship with that person and they don't share it with you. Or really commonly, the gap occurs between state and grassroots teams where there's like a digital team delivering lots and lots of messages to officials, but those messages aren't aligned with the messaging that state lobbyists are sharing with those officials, or the population of people that they're interacting with is different. So that's the why Quorum, why we built Quorum and to solve some of these challenges. And this webinar came out of an effort to understand like what does a really effective state government affairs team look like. There are lots and lots of different ways that organizations try to influence the policymaking process or kind of improve their reputation. You talk to any government affairs professional and they all kind of want the same thing. They want a better reputation amongst lawmakers. They want a more predictable or more friendly regulatory environment. But the paths that they take to get there are really diverse. And so we have built a number of solutions on the legislative tracking, the social listening side, to PAC management, grassroots advocacy, stakeholder engagement. We've built all these tools understanding that people are trying to influence the process differently, and we need to be able to support all the different ways that an organization might try to run its public affairs approach. And this presentation really came out of an effort to answer the question of like, what does a first-rate state affairs team look like? Because there are so many different ways to influence the process or to pursue those goals of like better reputation, friendlier regulatory, environment. There are so many ways to influence, to kind of go about trying to, get to those ends. Then we need to be prepared to share, from our clients, what does a first-rate team look like across all of these categories. And so at the top of the year, we spent a lot of effort talking to customers and thinking about if we were to build a framework for what does a function look like when it's, pretty nascent, when it's ad hoc, all the way to like a strategic state affairs function. What would those look like? And we could provide advice to clients on how they kind of move their team up the funnel. The right way to think about this webinar is to think about like, what is your own organization's kind of appetite for risk? And then from there, what levers do you want to be really exceptional at? And so we have a number of different categories I'm prepared to talk about today, from stakeholder mapping at the state space to social listening, legislative and regulatory tracking, grassroots advocacy. So some organizations, their appetite for risk is incredibly low, and they operate in an environment in which there's a lot of regulatory intensity, there is a lot of regulatory uncertainty, and so they may want to invest in being really exceptional at all of these different levers. Some organizations may see a more kind of modest regulatory environment and may invest in all these different approaches to keep it that way, or may invest in one or two really heavily. And the right way to think about this entire webinar is to think about kind of what your organization's risk profile looks like, and then how am I going to resource my state affairs function such that it fits that risk profile really well. I think most importantly here, you may feel that your operation is ad hoc in one area and then really strategic or proactive in another. You may feel that we do an exceptional job on the state government affairs, on the state legislative and regulatory tracking side, and then social listening is not something really that we've approached. And so there's something in here for everyone. And I'm excited to share kind of how many of the teams I work with think about going from kind of one tier to the next and investing in these levers to try to move the policymaking process. So I have created kind of for each of these categories, ad hoc, reactive, proactive, strategic, I have contextualized them in terms of the challenges that these particular teams face. I think it's easier for people to relate to like challenges that they're experiencing than outcomes that they want. And so for each of these categories, I have a couple of points per slide on what the typical challenges look like for each category. So for an ad hoc team, for a team that is like either there hasn't been a state government affairs program before, or one has been, incredibly under-resourced. The key term here is that, like, you're missing stuff. There's too many bills and regulations for you to effectively track. So things are falling through the gaps. Maybe you have a solution, in place, and that solution isn't working well. Maybe you don't have a solution in place. You're going to state legislative websites and trying to track everything, which is like a nightmarish scenario because, relying on state legislative websites is what we do with a full team of developers to monitor changes, but would quickly overwhelm a state government affairs professional doing everything themselves. But the key here is that, like, you're missing some of the developments that are coming out. Oftentimes, it's also exacerbated by there are multiple systems where information is being stored. And by system, I mean that in the broad sense. Like, there are people kind of keeping things in their head or writing things down on notebooks that live only in their notebooks. And so one of the most acute challenges here is one state team member is responsible for a couple states, and another state team member is responsible for another couple states. And those team members are dealing with the same issues, but are using very different talking points, using very different information from the business. The messaging is very different. And so the outcomes are potentially very different as well. So many systems and missing stuff. On the grassroots advocacy and stakeholder engagement side, often an ad hoc team is not doing a significant amount of proactive engagement to officials. That generally is on the back burner just because they're so busy dealing with bills and regulations they may have to track. Grassroots advocacy on the ad hoc side looks probably like you're doing one or two campaigns a year, and it's in response to a particular issue that comes up. So it truly is really reactive. The best grassroots advocacy programs that, from our client base are generally those that are evergreen, that you're consistently kind of sourcing stories from advocates, you're getting them familiar with your calls to action, you're engaging them in some way in the kind of policy development process. You don't have to be running campaigns throughout the year, but you probably have to get them familiar with your program and familiar with kind of the policy developments that may impact them. So this looks like many of our clients have like a state bill tracker directly on their advocacy page that auto updates with new bills from Quorum. That can be a really effective way to just kind of raise the profile and raise awareness of the issues that you're dealing with your advocates. But oftentimes for an ad hoc team, it's something they're either not focused on at all or doing pretty reactively. And then the final piece here is that it's really hard to do any kind of reporting back to your organization if you're overwhelmed with legislative and regulatory tracking, and all of the information that you're kind of coming back with from that tracking process lives in different places. So really difficult then to go and do reporting. I have, and we'll share this deck following this presentation. But I linked in here a case study from the Alzheimer's Association. I think the previous director of state affairs there who brought us on, who has a great quote in here. And this rings true for a lot of the patient advocacy organizations that we work with, where there are so many potential policy changes that impact them each year across all 50 states, DC, maybe even the territories if they're monitoring that. There are some good lessons in here from what their kind of first year looked like with Quorum after experiencing the kind of like, we're missing stuff kind of initial phase prior to Quorum. I do have in here, because I want to share a couple slides, and I took these so I anonymized some of the resources that I've built for some of our state government affairs clients. But we have a tool in our platform called Dashboards. And Dashboards was something we built out to help direct a user's attention towards the most valuable parts of the platform really quickly. We rolled out Dashboards in 2020, maybe. And at the time, we heard from clients like, hey, I'm a state government affairs professional. I'm dealing with lots of pieces of information. I'm dealing with bills, regulations. There's like social media mentions that I need to monitor. And I'm dealing with like grassroots messages that are being delivered to state lawmakers that I'm meeting with from a different team. So they were dealing with lots of siloed pieces of information, and we wanted a way to give them everything they needed as soon as they logged into the platform. And so one of the most popular widgets now is this like unreviewed bills with upcoming hearings. So like what's moving that you should care about that you haven't looked at. And we have a number of different, I have a couple other widgets in here to show you kind of how we're thinking about this. But these metrics really speak to the kind of place we're trying to get to with a lot of our state clients. In January and February, when lawmakers have introduced thousands and thousands of pre-filed bills, and their legislative session is kicked off. The first couple of weeks of session, there are probably hundreds of bills that may pile up that you may need to monitor. And we are getting to a place where we can really effectively communicate to teams, okay, how do you triage this influx of legislation at the top of the session season? So in the kind of far left widget here, or hopefully the screen's not reversed, but far left widget here, you'll see unreviewed bills. So this is a widget showing all of the unreviewed bills that match your search terms. And this number may be really high, as I said, in January and February. What we're trying to do is to help clients understand, okay, for the 360 bills in that unreviewed camp, how many are in front of key committees? So you can imagine if you are, again, to use my example with the Alzheimer's Association, if you are, care about issues that primarily impact healthcare, public health, whatever it may be, probably want to be able to filter down for things that have been assigned to those committees, or very often the appropriate committees or finance committees. You may also bring some kind of state-specific knowledge here as well. For my time as a Colorado lobbyist, I remember the State Affairs Committee was kind of like their kill committee. So maybe you want to deprioritize things depending on how the state runs its process. And some states may not have a process that they stick to, but this is still a pretty effective way to kind of triage at the beginning of sessions. And then the other way to kind of further narrow this down is to then look at, unreviewed bills in front of key committees that have upcoming hearings. And so very quickly, we've gone from like 360 bills that were just, you got to go through the list and see what matters, to the 5 that actually might move imminently. And this has been a really effective way for our clients to kind of triage that level of activity at the start of sessions and manage one of the kind of core challenges we're hearing from the market, which is there's too much stuff for me to track. So Quorum, obviously, we pull all of this information into our platform, but I think the real value that we get to is being able to help our clients move through it more quickly and build reports like this one. And really, one of our customer success leaders, who runs the kind of customer support team, has a great quote about a good report is something that helps you determine what your actionable next step is. And so that's really the philosophy behind our reporting tools, was that we should be able to help you understand where should your focus be, immediately following looking at that report. And going from the first widget to the second to the third, I think does that really effectively. Oh, I have another one here. I kind of forgot my own. I included this last minute. But another way we, for executives who may be overseeing a state government affairs function, something we're seeing more commonly now is a widget that automatically shows them the kind of active bill volume by team member. Maybe some proactive teams will think about the dialogue volume by team member. So active bill volume obviously shows you who's really overwhelmed right now, who could use some additional resources. And then the dialogue volume by team member tends to be a little forward thinking, like who may be overwhelmed in the next couple of weeks. Typically, lawmakers talk about issues before they introduce legislation on them. And so we've built this social listening tool to try to help clients understand, particularly in the off session, who's talking about a lot of issues, who may introduce legislation in the coming year, but also just as a mechanism to help our clients stay ahead of the policymaking process. So I've done some research on like how does a team that is not that we would call ad hoc in this framework, how does a team who has not built out the systems to kind of help them manage their workflow spend its time? And the key thing here is that they're spending a lot of time tracking bills, tracking regulations, but also tracking people, tracking lawmakers who are talking about a key issue, or tracking stakeholders who are part of a coalition trying to influence an issue. And our goal as a platform is to automate some of these tracking processes and help you move towards being able to do more on the proactive and strategic side. Stakeholder mapping, engaging the policy process before a lawmaker puts pen to paper and introduces a bill. And also, helping an organization kind of align the rest of their organization, or helping a state government affairs team align the rest of their organization behind the state government affairs mission. So, following the strategic lens, I have a slide to show how a team may spend its time differently when they move from the kind of ad hoc vector to the strategic vector. One of the ways that we're really excited about helping teams save time at the state legislative side is through our bill analysis, our AI-powered bill analysis tool. So our engineering team put a significant amount of effort earlier this year into building a chatbot that could answer any question about any piece of state legislation or federal legislation. And the goal here was that we had a lot of clients come back to us and saying, I'm looking at a lot of bills every year and I'm having to pull out, like, what are the effective dates? How does this bill impact my kind of niche area that I'm looking at? So the goal was to build a solution that could answer any question about any bill really quickly, and help our clients move through that kind of analysis part much more quickly. So moving along to the reactive team. And again, this is that kind of second tier of our framework. And the key here is that, you're probably not missing a whole lot of stuff on the kind of policy development side, but there are things you generally want to be doing that you're not able to do because of bandwidth. And one may be on the social listening side. So we see a lot of clients who are really effective at tracking legislation and regulations, but really aren't doing much on the social listening side of the kind of advocacy space. And why that's really important to state lawmakers in particular. The vast majority of of states have part-time legislative sessions. And so those vast majority are done by like mid-May. And the whole rest of the year, lawmakers are meeting with constituents, talking about issues, and talking about what they may introduce coming January. And we built this social listening solution to capture anything that any lawmaker says across social media, in their press releases, in their newsletters to constituents, and a number of other different venues to help our clients understand what the policymaking process might look like in the months to come. Typically, lawmakers are talking about issues before they're, introducing a bill. And so it can be a really helpful way to move your team from one that is reactive and just tracking legislation to proactive and identifying people who are talking about issues that you care about and setting up meetings to be a part of those conversations and to inform the policymaking process. This is something that's probably especially acute right now. There are going to be 2,000 new state lawmakers in January, and many of them probably are going to come into their offices already having opinions about healthcare and financial services, and many of the issues that you all work on every day. And so some of our best clients and some of our most proactive clients are thinking about how can we track what these people are saying when they're candidates, so that in between election day and swearing in day, we can go meet with them and ensure that if they introduce legislation, we can at least inform their kind of thoughts on how the best way to do that would be. On the advocacy side here too, for a reactive team, oftentimes that like stakeholder engagement may not have kind of clear lines of ownership, and so you have maybe a grassroots team that is delivering messages, a state and local team that is doing the kind of boots on the ground advocacy, and then other people who may be involved in meeting with lawmakers as well. And it becomes really messy to try to track all that without a system. So moving from a place of we're just tracking policy to we're trying to be more proactive by identifying what people are saying about us, that can be that's generally one of the places where it makes sense to try to implement some kind of system to track all those engagements. On the reporting side for a reactive team, generally we're seeing that like a typical report will show like moments in time, but not like the broader trends that those moments are a part of. And what I mean by that is they'll very often those, a team that is invested a lot in just kind of tracking updates will be able to report those updates, but will not be able to report the kind of future trends that come with doing like social listening really well or stakeholder engagement really well. I have another case study linked here from one of our clients, Destinations International, because I think it speaks really well to this transition of like we were fine tracking policy developments, but we didn't have the ability prior to quorum to go out and identify who the elected officials were who were kind of leading those policy developments. And having access to their social media handles, their newsletters is really critical to kind of moving to a more proactive place in state government policymaking. And again, so I include this slide and I used oil and gas as my example here, kind of my evergreen example. I include this slide. This really is a big differentiator for us. We have invested a significant amount in being able to track, policy adjacent material. So for state lawmakers, it's over a dozen total sources that we're monitoring them for where they're talking about particular issues. And some of those sources are better for some issues than others. Typically, we have a lot of healthcare clients who monitor newsletters to constituents because that seems to be a place that lawmakers talk about those issues to their constituents. And of course, we monitor social media because that's where, they're talking quite publicly about you and your organization. And if they're talking about you on social media, best to be able to track that so that someone else on your organization doesn't see that first. And feel free to plug into the Q&A or chat as well. Chat may be a better spot. If these challenges resonate for anyone here, if you have questions about kind of moving along from the ad hoc to reactive to proactive to strategic, that kind of continuum that we've thought about for state government affairs. So the proactive team, I tend to think of the proactive team as the one that is struggling with resourcing the most. They have a dedicated team that is collecting a lot of information. And then it's like, well, where do we go from here? We're capturing everything. Nothing's catching us off guard, but we're not really effectively engaging the rest of our organization behind our mission. So maybe that looks like, we have a state government affairs team that is doing a lot to track policy developments, but we don't really have, our grassroots team is not, coordinated in delivering messages to the lawmakers who are introducing unfriendly bills, or, maybe there's a gap somewhere along the line like that. Oftentimes the kind of broader theme here is that there's not a next step. The system is there, but it doesn't really help you figure out what to do next. So from the state policy professional perspective, you may be reporting on policy developments really effectively, but the organization is not kind of turning around and helping you actually influence the policymaking process all that effectively. I have another case study here because I think, and we'll share this in the follow-up as well, I think Uber has done a really exceptional job on the stakeholder management side. So obviously an organization, particularly a couple years ago, that saw a significant amount of potential policy risk to their business, and turned around and thought about how they could really effectively kind of change the narrative through stronger relationships with the people responsible for policy making. And so the critical quorum functionality that they leaned on was alerts, and we have really good alert optionality baked into the platform. But alerting them both on policy developments, but also on the social listening side. And I have some examples in here of how some of our clients have thought about reporting on stakeholder engagement. So these are all state-specific examples. I pulled these and anonymized these from some reports I had made for state government affairs professionals. But oftentimes that stakeholder reporting is not seen as significant a part of the state government affairs professional's role, but really can be one that moves the needle. And particularly when organizations are moving from a place where like, hey, we're tracking everything, we're in the ad hoc or reactive place, to we're being really proactive. Proactive really means you're kind of going out and building relationships and informing the policymaking process before lawmakers or regulators put pen to paper. And so a couple of the ways that clients have done this is that, and we do have a stakeholder mapping tool, Mackenzie, and I can share a little bit more about that in the coming slides here. But a couple of the ways that state teams are doing this is to report on engagements with particular stakeholder audiences. And so the first example you see on the left here is from a utility. And recently, I'm going to forget the name of the government agency, but an executive branch agency required that they start reporting on, that they start kind of sourcing feedback for proposed changes from lots of different stakeholder groups. And so many of the utilities that use Quorum have turned around and said, okay, we're going to track, when we're talking to public officials versus civic associations, environmental justice organizations, so that we have, if anyone ever asks or if we're audited, we have a really strong record of how we are reaching out to the cast of characters who may be impacted by our business. Another really effective one that clients have moved towards is like tracking meeting sentiment on a particular issue. So this is really easy to do in Quorum, but also yields some really cool reporting. And what I mean by that is, for any issue that you're tracking, you kind of plug in, hey, we had a meeting with this official. And all you have to do is say what the issue was and whether the meeting was positive, negative, or neutral. And I'll move ahead. I'll come back to the middle part of that. And what this has allowed clients to do is show how support for their issues has grown over time. I think the goal in life, whatever profession you're in, is to build graphs that go up and to the right. And this is a really effective way to quantify the very qualitative work that you may be doing as state affairs professionals. We talk to state teams all the time who say some executive got mad at me because a bad bill passed. Well, bad bills are going to pass. That's just part of the democratic process. And for every policy success you have, there is someone on the other side who has their own policy success. And the way that we have tried to encourage clients to report on information is to move to a place where they're showing how they are impacting hearts and minds over time. So for any issue that you're monitoring, in this example, it's 340B, for any issue you're monitoring, we can show the total number of engagements that you've had and the growth in the kind of positive direction over time. So you can go back to any executive and say, hey, yes, this bad bill did pass, but here are all the bills that didn't pass because of the kind of the how we are out there meeting with officials and changing the narrative over time. I worked with a client who had a U.S. presence and a U.K. presence, and both their teams were going in to meet with their C-suite. And the U.S. team used Quorum and came in with a report very similar to this one. We actually built out this type of reporting specifically for them, and now it's available for every Quorum client. But they were able to go into that meeting and say, here are the total number of engagements we've had in the past year, how those engagements went. And then they can also do some really effective asks from their executives from there. They're like, if we had better kind of talking points from our comms team on these particular issues, we would see even more success. Or if we had more engagement from a particular business unit or data from a business unit, we would be even more successful. And then the UK team had a slide with anecdote, a couple quotes about how much some official loved the organization. And anyway, the US team, it looked very buttoned up, and the UK team quickly reached out to get some additional Quorum licenses. But this is really the gold standard in I think stakeholder reporting for government affairs professionals, being able to show how many engagements you've had, how well they went, and then we can delineate it in Quorum by issue and build a similar type of report. The only other kind of widget I would add here is that we can obviously track, for any lawmaker, anytime they say anything on social media or any of those channels I mentioned. And some teams have really effectively narrowed this down to their key stakeholders. So if you're an automaker, you obviously want to know anytime the chairman of a state transportation committee talks about you. And so we can pull those mentions for you in these reports as well. And even if you're not tracking any engagements, we can still show over time how those mentions have become more friendly, hopefully not less friendly. But this is another way to kind of get at that type of reporting, is to look at, for a key, influential group of lawmakers, how are they talking about you and how has that changed? The other way to do this, a number of teams have implemented a kind of different framework here. One is the alignment breakdown of stakeholders. So tracking, people that you're meeting with, whether they are supportive, neutral, or opposed to whatever the issue is. Another really effective way that teams have done this is by tracking stakeholder awareness. So there are 5 categories here. The screenshot may be too small I hope everyone else can see it. But those categories are, you don't have any relationship with them, or they know your team, they know your issue, they support your issue, they're willing to take action on your behalf. And this came out of a case study we did with a client about 10 years ago who came to us and said, we have this huge cast of characters and it's really poorly organized. We want to know for each of the people that we know, what is their perception of us and how aligned are they to our mission? And so this essentially functions as a funnel and can be a really effective reporting mechanism as well. If you're able to show over time, here's the group of people who we have no relationship with, to those that are familiar with our team, are familiar with our issues, support our issues, and ultimately are willing to take action on our behalf. And this is, again, how teams go from being really kind of ad hoc and reactive to really strategic, is they think really deliberately about how they can build kind of their own state, evangelizers in the policymaking process, whether those are lawmakers or really engaged coalition partners or other types of stakeholders. And this type of reporting and kind of conceptually how this client thought about their stakeholder audience has been really helpful and transformative in this space. So a strategic public affairs team is generally one that is seen as kind of the broker of intelligence between many organizational functions. And what I mean by that is they're the ones who are the kind of the first team to have the information and also really effectively are able to communicate it across the organization. So what are the strengths of a strategic team? I mentioned one already, which is that kind of information acquisition leads to action. It leads to outcomes. You are not just like scrolling Twitter to see which lawmakers are talking about you and your issues, but you're able to really quickly prioritize like which state chairman of key, committees are talking about us. Are those positive, negative? Do we need to set up meetings? It is going from a place of tracking everything to being able to prioritize what information you're tracking really effectively and then take the kind of next step. Oftentimes there is a high degree of willingness from executives across the organization to kind of buy into a strategic function. You're able to leverage those relationships really effectively. Maybe you've identified people who are really supportive of your issues, who could benefit from, executive engagement. And that's really only possible because you have kind of a system to track that. On the reporting side, I think some of the examples I shared previously align really well with the strategic function. If you get to the point where you're reporting even just recording, like, here's the interaction we had, here's the issue it was related to, and here's how it went. That allows you to do some really strategic reporting and can ask questions of the rest of the business that become really interesting. And then generally the kind of key thing here is alignment. If you are, maybe you work within the context of a local team, a federal team, a grassroots team, and all of those functions are really aligned, both on the messaging for how are we communicating to lawmakers on particular issues, and then also just on the sharing relationships when state lawmakers become federal ones, when federal lawmakers have roles in particular states, or local, county commissioners become state lawmakers, or, top grassroots targets are really well known to the advocacy team, but not the state team. Those kinds of relationships are shared across the organization. We do have a case study here. I think the ALS Association has done a really good job aligning both their grassroots team, but then with the rest of the public affairs function. And the goal here, we'll share this out in case anyone is interested there, but the goal here, really the gold standard, is that we can show you a report like this one, which for a really strategic team helps them understand, okay, who is our PAC contributing to, who we're not having any follow-up engagements with. That's usually one of the first things we try to identify for clients, because they're coming to us like, hey, we've got all these different kind of functions engaging with a similar audience of a similar audience of lawmakers. but there is not communication between them. And this has been a really effective way for us to kind of score wins with our clients when we're able to share a report like this that shows who your advocacy team is delivering messages to, who, you're not following up with, or just there's misalignment there, or where grassroots and PAC are misaligned. But generally, the goal here is that, we close the gap, and becoming a strategic team is about kind of closing that gap. And our best clients have really kind of deliberately thought about, hey, if we're going in to meet with a particular state official, can we kind of, deliver some constituent messages the day before that meeting? So we're really top of mind, and we can reference those constituent messages as we go in to have that conversation. So I shared a little bit earlier about what does the ad hoc team, how does their, for a team that we've kind of thought of in the ad hoc category, how are they spending their time? And I do have a slide here that shows a little bit about how kind of teams spend their time when they move from one benchmark to the next. And the key here is that the amount of time spent tracking is really significantly reduced. Our goal is to be able to help get an organization as much information as they need and be able to move through it really quickly. And I think building out those processes that enable them to move through information and determine that actionable next step is the value add here. And it helps teams go from a place where they're spending almost 75% of their time just tracking stuff to one where they're able to really grow their stakeholder mapping and engagement, maybe grassroots advocacy, and then kind of the reporting piece as well. You can spend a lot less time just looking around for bills and amendments and, the kind of regulations that come out of, enacted legislation, and a lot more time spent on the kind of proactive, how do we inform a policymaker's understanding of our industry or our issue? How do we be a part of that conversation? And again, part of our goal with this, with some of I mentioned one of our AI capabilities that's live now, the Copilot Analyze function, which is your kind of chatbot for any question you have about a bill, is that we help move teams from one category to the next as quickly as possible. So we help teams move from a place where they're spending a lot of time tracking or on analysis to one that's able to do more proactive engagement as well. Importantly, these teams kind of make themselves central to strategic decision making. And there are a couple key features here that enable that I'll briefly cover before we get to questions. One is on the reporting side. So being a really strategic team not only means you're really effectively tracking policy updates, means you can kind of forecast some of the trends, and maybe you're doing that through your own, you're tracking meetings and the issues those meetings were about and the sentiment of those meetings. That can be a really effective way to report out on trends. The other one is to use our social listening data and say we're seeing huge spikes in how lawmakers are talking about 340B. I think that was my example from earlier. And so we should anticipate some coming legislation in the next session about it. But reporting is one of the ways that helps strategic teams become a part of the business conversation. The other is on that social listening side. And so just being able to track what lawmakers are saying, in advance of them doing anything. We built this social listening tool 10 years ago. And the goal at the time was just it's kind of cool what lawmakers are saying about on Facebook and on Twitter. And now we are covering lots and lots of different sources of information, as you can see on the left side of this screenshot here. And the goal is that we really are giving our clients more runway to respond to a potential issue. If all you're doing now is tracking when bills are introduced, we can show you when lawmakers are talking about bills that they're going to introduce and give you kind of more of a heads up in advance of any session. And this is really acute at the state level when sessions are so compressed, but obviously lawmakers are using social media and these different sources year round. Another way to think about this social listening data, and something we've seen a number of really strategic organizations do. So in my example here, I used financial services. It's just a random example. But the sheet here shows lawmakers on the Senate Finance Committee. And we can do this for any state, for any subset of committees. This is just my example. And the goal here is we can show which lawmakers are talking a lot about Bank of America, about Wells Fargo, about JPM, about US Bank, Truist. And any one of these organizations can filter to see, okay, which one of these lawmakers is talking about, us or our competitors most frequently. But they're also able to sort this information. And so they can see which one of these lawmakers is talking a lot about someone else in our industry, but we're kind of falling below the radar. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe you're flying under the radar. But very often there are other organizations who are going to build a significant amount of, going to a lot of effort to build relationships with lawmakers. So they may have a really positive view of your industry, and you can benefit from that engagement as well. And we've seen clients do this a number of different ways. This is one example. Another example is like looking at like nonprofits or coalition partners that you may have. Lawmakers may be talking about like patient advocacy groups. And if you're a pharma organization, you want to go in and say, hey, we work with this patient advocacy group really closely. And, we want to talk to you about how we benefit them as well. And then the final piece here, I talked a little bit about dashboards. I won't spend as much time there, but this really is a game changer, particularly if you're monitoring all 50 states. Our goal with the dashboard is to get you, direct your attention towards the most valuable parts of the, platform as quickly as possible. So my example here was, being able to look at a widget that says here 380 unreviewed bills down to the 36 that are in front of key committees down to the 5 that have, assigned committee hearings. So really effectively triage that information. And then the final piece, and really our kind of, the keystone part of our strategy is to help teams integrate across the different functions that make up their public affairs universe. So help identify gaps between the state team, the grassroots team, the PAC team, the state team, the PAC team, and so forth. So I know I ran a little longer than I wanted to. I know I have a couple questions in the chat to answer. So Bree, I'll take a look at your question right now. Let me read this and then I can respond. Yes, so that is probably a question better suited for our customer support team. So Dana, if you want to make a note of Bree's name, maybe we can reach out following the call and just connect her to someone on our support team, because we do have a dedicated customer success team to help with exactly what you described, who are very familiar setting up search terms. And so I'll make sure we follow up and connect you to the right person. Any other questions, Dana? I'm sorry, I'm scrolling through the chat. I know we have a few different ways that people submit questions here.
So I apologize if you already answered this one, Henry, but Mackenzie asked in the Q&A section if Quorum has a stakeholder mapping tool.
Yes.
If you already covered that.
I did very briefly just say, okay. Yes, we do. But yes, we do. And we could certainly follow up there with more information. It is a big part of our platform as we're, trying to help clients go from a place of tracking to proactively engaging. So yes, we definitely do. Great. Any other questions? Feel free to plug them into the chat here as well. And I will, or the Q&A, and I will take a look at the.
Yep. And if we're wrapping up with questions, then just a reminder that we'll distribute the recording in the next day or two. So you can keep an eye out on your email for that. And then we'll hang around for a couple more questions just in case, but that's coming your way.
I got a couple that I will answer right now. We do not need to be integrated into a company's IT systems. We're a cloud-based software. You would access us at quorum.us through any browser. Matthew, where do you access the social listening tool? So this is for any clients. So Matthew, we can follow up with more information afterwards, but from your home screen on the tab on the left side of your screen, you will see a number of different data sets. Those are like bills, regulations, officials. There's also a data set called documents. Documents is, we'll pull up, I'll go back to it, this screen, where you will be able to see the document type and all those sources. Gavin, very good question. This is probably, again, a question best answered by someone on our support team who can kind of look at what term you're using. So maybe, Dan, if we could make a note of Gavin's name and connect him to support following this as well.
Definitely.
I'll take a look at the chat too. Make sure I didn't miss any there. Thanks, Molly, for sharing the case studies. That was smart. All right. If no other questions, Dana and I will wrap it up. The presentation and the deck will be shared out after the call with everyone who registered and attended. And certainly, reach out to me or, if you are a Quorum client and want to learn a little more about some of the topics I addressed here today, feel free to reach out to your customer success manager or directly to me as well, and I can connect you to the appropriate person.
If you have some general questions, you can also reach our team at info@quorum.us, and we'll be happy to route you to the right folks. If you don't know exactly who you need to be speaking to, we're happy to help you out with that.
All right.
So I
Thanks
think we'll
very
go
much. Go ahead, Dan.
Thanks so much, Henry. Great minds. Thanks so much, Henry, for your wonderful, thoughts and strategies here. I learned a lot. I think probably everyone here learned a lot. So really appreciate you coming out, speaking to everyone, and we'll go ahead and wrap up now. Thanks, everyone.